All right. Hey, everyone, and welcome. My name is Omari Everett Phillips. I'm the chair of the Society of Civil War Historians Graduate Students Connection Committee. And along with the Southern Historical Association's Graduate Student Council, we'd like to thank you for coming to this event. And so we're very excited to be co-hosting this virtual book talk with Dr. Robert Bland on his new work, Requiem for Reconstruction, Black Counter Memory, and the Legacy of the Low Country's Lost Political Generation. So before we dive completely into what I'm sure is going to be a great book talk and discussion, we'd like to just make you aware of a few events that are coming up that might be of interest to graduate students and the larger community that's gathered today. So this Friday, March 13th, is the deadline to get a proposal and to be part of the 5 minutes in the field graduate student lightning round that's going to take place at the Society of Civil War Historians Conference in Richmond, Virginia. Dropping the link for that into the chat now. And also on Friday, June 19th, at the same conference in Richmond, we'll be hosting a professional development luncheon entitled Publishing Your First Article. It's going to take place from noon until 1:15 p.m. And the event is going to feature Dr. Robert Bland, Graham Dozer, and Matthew Stanley. All right, so let's get started then. So our guest today, of course, is Dr. Robert D. Bland. Dr. Bland is an assistant professor at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and the editor of the Society of Civil War Historians blog, Muster. Dr. Bland is a historian of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with an emphasis on the African American experience and the postbellum South. His research and teaching engage questions of racial formation, electoral and cultural politics, and battles over historical memory. The book that he'll be speaking about and taking questions on, Requiem for Reconstruction, examines the legacy of Reconstruction in the African American public sphere. It explores the efforts of Black Southern Carolinians and their Northern allies to preserve the last bastion of racial republicanism in the South during the half century that followed the Compromise of 1877. In doing so, Dr. Bland illuminates, a series of connections between grassroots struggles in the South Carolina Low Country over political patronage, disaster relief, local schools, and representations of Gullah folklore, as well as the simultaneous debate in the national Black press over how to contest the cultural and intellectual dimensions of the emerging Jim Crow order. Dr. Bland, thank you for being with us today, and the spotlight is yours.
Amari, I really appreciate that kind welcome. I'm happy to be in conversation with graduate students coming from both the Civil War era and Southern historical perspective. I hope this talk engages questions that are exciting and interesting to both of you. I'm as interested in talking about method and how we kind of think about the craft of historical research as the specific topic. So again, I'm looking forward to the questions and comments you'll have afterward. I'll share my screen now. So the book is titled Good for Reconstruction, and it examines the afterlife, the life and the afterlife of a cohort that I call the Reconstruction generation. In the beginning, I'm going to highlight one member of that generation, Benjamin Franklin Randolph, born free in the North, attended Oberlin College, served as an educator in Northern schools, was the principal of a Black school outside of Buffalo, New York, before the Civil War. When the war came, he, like many Black Northerners, heeded the call, understood that it was not only a moment for Black Americans to demonstrate patriotism and faith in the Union, but it was a turning point in this broader idea that Michelle Mitchell calls racial destiny, right? This turning point in African American history, and seeing emancipation as a kind of ground floor of that racial destiny. Many Black Northerners, members of the former abolitionist movement, sought to make history, right? They wanted to be a part of this new chapter. Franklin joins the United States Colored Troop, the 26th Regiment, serves as a chaplain of that unit. After the war, he remains in the South, helps found a newspaper, serves as a Freedmen's Bureau agent, is going to rise in the ranks of Republican politics, become a leader in the state Republican Party, will be a major fixture in the turning point of the National Republican Party, the first Black person to serve as an elector of a national party, in many ways, right, he embodies, right, what W.E.B. Du Bois calls abolitionist democracy, as a major force in shaping and making the Republican Party in South Carolina, right, a leading light of that party. On October 16th, 1868, as he's campaigning across the state in the state's upcountry, the region of the state that has the least amount of African American citizens, on the site that is the kind of hotbed for a nascent Ku Klux Klan movement. Randolph is campaigning. He's trying to drum up support for the party. And while crossing from one train station to the next to continue his tour, he's assassinated in cold blood by three men who are not wearing masks, who people know who they are in the community. These men are briefly detained, but they are not prosecuted for their crimes. No one is prosecuted for the murder of Benjamin Randolph. But his assassination is going to serve as a clarion call for this larger political movement, right? He's going to serve as one of the first martyrs of this Reconstruction generation. In the effort to remember him, he's going to be commemorated in the journal of the state house. He's going to have a cemetery named after him. His story will ring both in South Carolina as a way to unite the Republican Party, but it will also connect the various facets of the Northern and Southern Black political world in a way that captures the meaning of Reconstruction in African American memory. And this is at the center of my book, right? Requiem for Reconstruction. I'm trying to examine a specific political movement that happens in a specific place, Reconstruction in the South Carolina Low Country, a story that's been well told among Southern historians and historians of the Civil War. But I'm interested in the way that this story reverberates, right? Not just a kind of story of grassroots politics, right? Kind of a nation under their feet. But how might we think about the cultural politics of this political world? And in this way, I'm really interested in thinking about the psychic cost of what occurred in Black memory after Reconstruction was defeated. And this is a slow defeat. It's not happening all in one place. But in the Black press, in the kind of various corners of the Black Northern talented 10th world, in Black schools and historically Black colleges, and ultimately in the first chapter of African American history, you see a grammar emerging around talking about Reconstruction that serves as one of the foundational ways that Black Americans told the story of African American history. This is something you really see crystallized in the Carter G. Woodson Negro History Month era of the 1920s and 1930s. This is a story of paramilitary violence. This is a story of historical erasure. But this is also a story of resistance. This is a story of Black counter memory, Black storytelling, African American intellectual history. And again, I'm trying to connect this into a number of different historiographies, right? The book that looms the largest, Race and Reunion by David Blight, the Requiem in this riffs a little bit on Blight talking about Reconstruction having the cadence of a Requiem, had the tones of a Requiem. Thinking about this conversation he begins about race and sexual reconciliation, race and memory that a number of scholars have examined and explored. I'm interested in the various ways that this is a story not only of the South, but of a kind of nascent Black nationalism. Thinking of nationalism different than Stephen Hahn, and we can think about that and talk about that later, but in the kind of ways that a network is stitched together of the African American press, the Black public sphere, work that goes back to Elsa Barkley Brown, but most recently you can see in the work of someone like Kidada Williams, someone like Lonnie Davis, in addition to Steve Kantrowitz's really fantastic work examining Black abolitionists in Boston and thinking about a very small community that has an outsized impact in how we understand the meaning of the 14th Amendment, Reconstruction, and the March for Citizenship. A work that parallels and thinks along similar lines of my work is Imani Perry's May We Forever Stand, which is offering a cultural history of the Black national anthem. That's a song that emerges as a way to preserve a type of Reconstruction era memory. I think thinking about that as a cultural product is one of the parallels and stories that I see occurring along the same side as the Requiem for Reconstruction. We might also think about the recent book, Brass Roots Democracy, which examines New Orleans brass bands as a way to think about the sonic and aesthetic dimensions of Reconstruction. But there's a kind of wave of works that are coming out that are examining Black counter memory in different ways. We might also think about Stephen K. Prince's The Ballad of Robert Charles in this conversation. Again, this begins in a specific place. I'm interested in the South Carolina Low Country. For you who are Civil War era scholars, you probably know a lot about the Battle of Port Royal, the Port Royal experiment. This is an epicenter of emancipation, both the wartime emancipation of David Hunter, but the kind of early stages of both the initial declaration of emancipation given by Lincoln in 1862, but January 1st, 1863, the kind of classic story of people hearing the speech for the first time, the song of My Country, 'Tis of Thee breaking out. Right? This place and this site has an outsized story in Civil War memory. So I'm interested in this story of Reconstruction as it begins in wartime Reconstruction in the Low Country. But I'm also interested in the ways that this rehearsal for Reconstruction treks through not only those famous white abolitionists, Laura Town, Gideon, Philbrick, people like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, but also what I call the Black Port Royal experiment. These are people like Charlotte Fortin, who people are familiar with, Martin Delany, but also people maybe are less familiar with. Mary Still, the sister of William Still, the conductor of the Underground Railroad, Francis Whipper, people like Benjamin Franklin Randolph, William J. Whipper, another Black Northerner, nephew of William Whipper, the Black abolitionist, served in the Freedmen's Bureau. And a lot of these people are coming to the South Carolina Low Country with the Freedmen's Bureau. That are arriving in this region as teachers for the AME Church. They're interested again in this story of racial destiny, of remaking and reimagining the American South after the destruction of slavery, taking a major role in shaping that. The story I want to draw out of this is, right, it's not only the movement to the South, which is an important story that more historians should articulate the specific kind of story of abolition and the Black abolitionist movement to the South during the war. But what happens afterward, right? And this is where I want to highlight the New National Era by Frederick Douglass. I want to highlight the Christian Recorder and a wave of African-American newspapers that emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War. Reconstruction and the Gilded Age really served as a high tide for the Black press in ways that I don't think we've fully kind of contextualized. And so I'm trying to tell the story of not only the rise of the Black press, but the rise of a Black political beat, right? A kind of specific type of Black political reporting that occurs during this Reconstruction era that really shapes this counter memory of Reconstruction. Again, this is the story of Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. This is the story of abolition democracy. South Carolina is going to be hyper visible, and scholars have been highlighting this since Du Bois. You can go to Thomas Holt, Black Over White. You can think about Stephen Hahn and any number of scholars who've examined and highlighted the way that the South Carolina State House is the only state house of the Black majority in the lower house. This is kind of going to be the embodiment of the radical political project of Reconstruction, right? This kind of march towards multiracial democracy. It's going to be the state that's lampooned the most. We think about James Pike, and I'm going to return to James Pike in the prostrate state. But this is a site that is not only kind of a major center for free people's ambitions, but I also want to highlight those free-born, those northern-born Black Americans who are arriving to the Low Country during the war, remaining after the war, and helping the story of the Reconstruction project filter through the Black press. Again, so this is a familiar story, but again, told through a different lens. I want to highlight Robert Smalls in a different way, right? Many of you who are, again, Civil War era scholars know more about Robert Smalls than most of the nation. And again, he's an incredible figure, right? Someone who should have not only documentaries, but a Disney film after his exploits, right? The kind of famous capture of the Planner and returning a Confederate gunship to the Union Navy, immortalized as a war hero. We know that he serves 5 terms in Congress after the Civil War, but the granular details of that political experience, but also the broad story, right? What happens if we center Robert Smalls as a political figure, a political thinker, a political knife fighter, if you will, right? The kind of figure who emerges in the Gilded Age Republican Party that rewards the spoils system, rewards patronage. Some of you may have seen the recent film, Death by Lightning, that examines James Garfield's Republican Party and the way that figures like Roscoe B. Conkling kind of operated the port of New York. Robert Smalls, while not a Tammany Hall style political boss, has some kind of elements that are similar to that, right? He kind of is an important figure in organizing politics, the mediator for the Republican Party. It serves as a counterbalance to the elite-driven, talented, tense story brought by Black Northerners, right? He's born in slavery. He's going to represent the Gullah Geechee population in a way that many in the talented tech and the Black press will increasingly become uncomfortable with, right? This is someone who was not taught to read or write during slavery, will remain a kind of figure who deeply embodies the perils and the promise of emancipation, the ways that not everyone emerges out of emancipation in the very kind of Whiggish, elite kind of sense of Black racial performance. But again, he is a kind of embodiment of a very important democratic ideal, right? That works for working class ways, that works in political ways. It makes him a lightning rod in many ways. And I'm interested in complicating that story of Robert Smalls in this book. Again, this is a story of sexual reconciliation and the cultural dimensions of reunion and reconciliation of national reunion. Many of you are familiar with the classic story of in David Blythe's Race and Union, where despite a powerful unionist and emancipationist memory at the beginning of the war, a lost cause white supremacist narrative begins to capture the levers of cultural power, which in turn shape the dimensions and the channels of historical storytelling, of national and collective memory, of regional memory among the United Dogs of the Confederacy and other Southern groups. I'm interested in this story, right? I'm interested in the ways that narratives around the prostrate state emerge, the ways that Reconstruction is demonized, especially South Carolina, the Low Country's Reconstruction era is demonized in a way that helps craft, right, this racist interpretation, this lost cause myth. And so, on the one hand, right, this is a story that well. This is a story that has traveled throughout the recent history of race and memory, of historical memory of the Civil War era. But I'm trying to capture a specific response. Right, there's a danger in using the term counter memory. Sometimes it reduces Black intellectual life to only a secondary movement to responses. There's a cohort of scholars who argue that the lost cause should be understood as the original counter memory and that the emancipationist and unionist memories preceded. But I am thinking about the ways that African American history responds to, right? It's kind of confronting a deeply racist cultural sphere, and that a Black counter public sphere that emerges after the Civil War, right? It has back channels in earlier history in the antebellum period, but in the postbellum moment, especially after Reconstruction, is slowly fading in the South, not defeated, but fading. You see in places like Washington, D.C., as well as Philadelphia, as well as New York, but also in the national Black press, a news story about Reconstruction that highlights these Black politicians as they're being demonized. And this is happening at a moment where the first kind of generation of those politicians are beginning to pass away or die young. People like Robert Brown Elliott, people like Martin Delany. So there's an intentional effort to retrieve this history, but also debate this history. It's not a one-sided story. The book begins in Bethel Literary Society. The Bethel Literary and Historical Society is this lyceum that exists and takes place in Washington, D.C. at the Metropolitan AME Church. This is a site where Washington's talented 10th, but kind of a broader audiences are centering and kind of gathering to embrace and engage history. And William J. Whipper, one of these figures who's a judge during Reconstruction in the state legislature during Reconstruction, gives a speech. And during that speech, Robert Small is still serving in the Congress. He challenges this debate. There's other figures in Reconstruction who are challenging this debate through this center, right? This lyceum, this literary hall meets between the 1880s to the 1920s. And one of the recurring themes in this lyceum, in these historical debates, is what was the meaning of Reconstruction? How should Reconstruction be remembered? They're engaged in a number of other conversations around racial destiny, around the Black past, around African American intellectual life. Again, this is a moment where Harvard Law School is beginning to emerge as a foundation for a new legal class. This is a moment where the M Street School is emerging, and many Black Northerners and Black Southerners are traveling to DC as this hub of Black intellectual life. But I'm highlighting that this story is deeply connected and preserving, right, the Reconstruction era story broadly, but also the Low Country story in particular. Finally, I want to conclude in thinking about the passing of the Reconstruction generation, right? So Robert Smalls, who again is a major figure during the Civil War, serves as a congressman, is going to be a political figure well into the 1890s, early 1800s as a kind of collector of customs, right? Working this port of customs. It's going to make him friends. It's going to make him enemies. In 1895, he's going to be standing in front of the South Carolina State House for the last time, trying to defend the 1868 Constitution as a number of Democratic leaders are trying to undo the Reconstruction era Constitution, the move that will bring about disfranchisement and then segregation. Robert Small survives that, and kind of Reconstruction in miniature survives, right? There's still African American officials elected at the local level in Beaufort well until the 1910s. Robert Smalls will serve in the Port of Customs until Woodrow Wilson effectively segregates the federal occupations during his first term. After which, right, Robert Smalls is sick. He's suffering from diabetes. He ultimately passes away in 1915. This is the final wave of deaths that are occurring during the Reconstruction generation. Many people are very aware that Reconstruction is coming to an end. And so Robert Small's funeral serves as this last call, this last kind of swan song for this Reconstruction generation. The image on the right, the image that began this lecture, Shadows of Light, The Last of the Old Guard, is an image from a 1917 issue of the Crisis, the official magazine of the NAACP. So again, this is W.B. Du Bois as the editor of the NAACP. The NAACP is beginning its Southern-facing campaign of building new chapters. One of these chapters is in the Low Country. Several chapters are in the Low Country, both Beaufort, Charleston, Savannah. Um, we can't understand, right, the rise of African American history, rise of African American politics, this churn in African American intellectual life without understanding that the ability to hold and retain Reconstruction served as a central part of this story. So I want to close here and open it up for questions, talk a little bit more about method, but again, thinking about the passing of Reconstruction as having a funereal cadence, right? This passing of Robert Smalls, the passing of Benjamin Randolph, the passing of a number of figures, right, helps us see these flashpoints in this broader story of Reconstruction's memory.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bland. All right, so we can take questions now. I know I have questions for sure, but if others have questions, we'll start with you all first.
I couldn't figure out the raise a hand feature. Sorry, Omari. Uh, Dr. Bland, I have a question on Northern Black abolitionists. I know you're discussing in South Carolina around late 1860s, 1870s. Also during that time, you have the 10 Years' War going on in Cuba. And there's kind of like a divergence of attentions where I know a lot of like Frederick Douglass and his followers are paying attention to South Carolina, and Henry Highland Garnet, Samuel Raymond Scottron, and theirs are looking to Cuba. So is there a bit of some of these northern abolitionists are more concerned about like Pan-Africanism movements and abolition in the Western Hemisphere versus um, just African Americans in the inside the United States? And how does that affect memory later on?
Right. Now, that's a fantastic question. I'm thinking back to this special issue in the JCWE on Black International that appeared a couple months ago. And I think Sarah Payne at College of Charleston has got a really fascinating project that examines kind of Scatron's memory. I'm thinking about Cuba, Brazil, and this kind of internationalist perspective. I don't think attention was divided, right? The crystallization of a um, Pan-Africanist or internationalist vision is happening, right? I mean, we can go back to um, the early 19th century and think about the ways like David Walker, right, is talking about colored citizens of the world, right? There's a longer history here, right? But Robin D.G. Kelly's refrain to think about African American history as an antidote for fascism, an antidote for a kind of narrow type of nationalism. Um, Again, the Low Country serves as a hub for this in some ways. I'm thinking about the immigrationist movement from Charleston to Liberia that's happening in the late 1870s. Um, I document this briefly in my book, but this is a moment where kind of there's not only kind of an elite-driven story that's happening in the Black press, a story that I really see in figures like John Edward Bruce, who begins writing for the National Black Press, and toward the end of his life, is a writer for the United Negro Improvement Association as a devoted Garveyist, and kind of encourages Garvey to name one of the UNIA's ships after Robert Smalls. But also, right, there's a story here that is more vernacular, right? This is a story where freed people across the South are losing faith in the ability to make a living in the South. And so some people are looking at Liberia, some people like Evan Painter, I've highlighted, and more recently, Caleb Gale and his work, Black Moses, are looking to the Trans-Mississippi West, to Kansas, to Oklahoma. Think about Elena Roberts' work here as well. So there's again, right, a Whiggish internationalism, right? Douglas serving as kind of a thinker on Santa Domingue and part of that annexation process. But there's also a vernacular, more democratic Black internationalism that's kind of running side to side of this moment too.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jeremy, go for it.
Jeremy, I think.
Yeah, thanks very much for the talk. I was curious, you talk about the passing of the Reconstruction generation, and they obviously have this goal of perpetuating the memory of Reconstruction. How well did the institutions you talk about that were founded by the Reconstruction generation endure in terms of being able to pass that memory on beyond the generation themselves with the historical societies and the archives and such?
Right, right. No, that's a great question, right? I think right, the central institution that is preserving the memory of Reconstruction is the Black press. And so those who are moving through those various channels have a multi-generational memory. People like John Edward Bruce, but also we could think of someone like T. Thomas Fortune here, who kind of again begins his journalistic career in the 1880s, continues to serve in the Black press well into the early 20th century. They are maintaining relationships with Reconstruction era figures. They continue to write about Reconstruction after after the fall of the Jim Crow curtain. So these stories are preserving and circulating in the Black press. But also, I think the Bethel Literary Society is one of these institutions. It begins to fade. I don't have an exact day of when this organization ceases to exist, but by the time you get to the 1920s, you see these discussions of when Du Bois shows up. There's a description that this is the largest meeting that the dwindling society has seen in years. And by the time you get to the 1930s, you're only reporting in news you get about the Bethel Literary Society is the passing of former members of the Bethel Literary Society. So in the interwar period at the kind of end point, and this is also, again, at the point where those ideas are being plucked and pulled into the Association for Negro Life and History, what becomes the SALA, the Journal of Negro History, which becomes the Journal of African American History. Those organizations begin collecting records. They begin writing to former Reconstruction figures and their children, trying to build an archive that doesn't exist, right? We have obviously the Dunning School writing in the late 19th century, but we have very few Southern institutions preserving the records of African Americans, preserving firsthand accounts of Reconstruction era. Those white historians are not going through the Black press papers. And this is what people like Monroe work with this Ambush Taylor. And one of the minor arguments in this book is that that work is what Du Bois is really beginning to pull from when he's beginning to write on Black Reconstruction. He writes in the 1920s, he writes about Reconstruction again as a revision of that earlier The Souls of Black Folk paper that he gives before the American Historical Association. And he revises that story in the 1920s and again in the 1930s, building on the back of this earlier scholarship.
And we have a question in the chat from Caleb. He says, "Thank you for the chat. I have two questions. First, you mentioned that much of the debates about Reconstruction memory occurred in lyceums across the country, among other venues. Did you see any debates occurring in lectures delivered at mechanics institutes? How did class influence these debates? And second, could you talk more about how you interact with Kay's, Stephen Prince's The Ballad of Robert Charles and Kadada Williams' They Saw Death Coming?"
That's a very sophisticated question, right, with multiple parts. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, I see in some of these colored conventions, these mechanics institutes, conversations around the Reconstruction era, ways that, again, those organizations are discussing these broader questions of citizenship, but also thinking of the story of Black history more broadly. Again, there's something particular happening in the Bethel Literary Historical Society. And again, I want to tag that as an institution that has a particular resonance in crafting a nascent grammar of African American history. But this is something that you see in the Black press across the nation. I mean, in many ways, right, one of the things that Bethel Literary Society is doing is, right, taking these ideas, transmuting them through the Black press to other nodes in the Black world, other kind of urban centers, other places where those who are thinking and debating questions of racial destiny are drawn upon. I engage Prince's work as a way to think about cultural memory in the broadest sense, right? Thinking about how to incorporate music. Prince is really good about thinking about rival geographies and thinking about mapping New Orleans and its neighborhoods. Book is really kind of deft in how it thinks about violence. And then, right, the part towards the end where you're thinking about the afterlife of Robert Charles. We are in an afterlives moment. I think I have 5 or 6 friends who got that word somewhere in a book title, either now or coming out soon. So you can always count on academics to be original, but I think there is something there, right? We're reflecting on the end of things at this particular moment in history, right? We're all reflecting on generational turns. We're reflecting on the neoliberal order. We're reflecting on how we periodize, whether it's in the Civil War or Reconstruction or in the 20th century, the New Deal order. So I think there's something happening right around framing in the zeitgeist. And Kadada and its work is really, really smart on the Black press. And so just thinking about the way the Black press covered lynching, covered racial testimony, that's a line that I saw is also running through my book. Our book follows a similar periodization. So I think there's very few books that are as good on the 1880 to 1920 period as Kadada Williams' first book. They left great marks on me. They saw death coming. I'm realizing that's the second book, which is also really smart on memory and trauma. I draw more on the first book than Kadada's second.
I'll jump in with a question then. Just picking up on something that you talked about in your talk there, could you explain the differences in how you view nationalism versus how Stephen Hahn has sort of brought these sort of ideas up?
Right. That's I think Hahn is very much thinking along the lines of political ideology. And so he's interested in precursors to 20th century Black nationalism. And it's really interested in rooting that in the folk thought of Black Southerners, thinking about a working class vernacular Black nationalism. Right? He's looking for 19th century Malcolm X's, right? And I think that's an important cause. That's something that obviously was a generational intervention in terms of understanding Black political thought. I think by a degree or two, he turns the attention too far to the South, right? And not to say that we can't have a good Southern history that kind of thinks about the South on its own terms, right? This is kind of an ongoing project of the Black South studies, the kind of new Black South scholars. But in losing, right, the Black nationalist currents in the antebellum North, losing some of the national story, losing the story of the Black press, I think Hahn is unable to see some of the questions that we kind of get from a Benedict Anderson, so to speak, right? Thinking about imagined communities, thinking about the specific cultural framework that organizes Black political thought, if that makes sense. So I'm interested in the not only the kind of ideology and the political ideology that has the kind of explicit punching power, right? The organizing mechanism to build social movements, but I'm interested in the afterlife of those social movements, the cultural architecture of those social movements, and the ways that that informs other types of Black thought, not just Black political thought.
Thank you for that. And I have another question I think that's a bit more sort of nuts and bolts. So you talked about some of the works that provide inspiration or that sort of helped you through your own work. I'm wondering about the archival research that you did around this. What sort of places did you go to? What did you find in those places? Is there anything that stands out to you as particularly interesting that made it into the book or maybe didn't make it into the book?
Right. I was meeting with some graduate students a couple of weeks ago in the Low Country talking about this question, right? I was doing a talk around chapter 5 of the book, and I was realizing that chapter 5, which examines disfranchisement, examines the Seattle Storm of 1893, examines a kind of set of cases where Robert Small's legacy is being debated in the Treasury Department records, and kind of these records are making it to President Benjamin Harrison. Captures both the beginning of the research, the very first thing I did as a researcher and graduate student in a research seminar before comps, and then it captured the very last thing that I kind of captured in the archives. And so I went to graduate school at the University of Maryland, and this is the house that the Freedmen and Southern Society Project built. And so I spent a lot of time on campus thinking about those records, but also within our Stone's Throw campus, you had archives too. This is where I went into the Red Cross records and initially was thinking about writing a dissertation around Black environmental thought, Black ecologies, and Black responses to natural disasters. But in this kind of examination of the Sea Island storm, this 1893 hurricane, I came across more and more discussion in the aftermath of that record from both white Southerners, Black Southerners, as well as white Northerners around the story of Reconstruction, what Reconstruction meant. And I said, well, this feels similar to the cadences that Blight was trying to describe, but it shifts it in a different direction. So that project, that research paper begins to organize the beginning, and that's taken me to South Carolina several times. I spent a lot of time in the Low Country, both in microfiche rooms and papers of old planter families in the Avery Center, right? Kind of the Black school records, and kind of capturing the nodes of Black memory requires you to be omnivorous, requires you to read a lot of different things across the grain. Very few of the people that I'm writing about in the Reconstruction generation left a full archival account of their lives. But I think once you recognize the map of Reconstruction, and the map is bigger than just the South Carolina and the Low Country, that you have to kind of connect nodes across different points of the Black world, a different story began to emerge.
Thank you for that. And we have a question in the chat from Julian. Thank you for a great talk. I had a question about sources. What issues did you have with accessing certain documents? If you couldn't access records that you needed, how did you account for that in your work and analysis? In particular, what did you do when historical actors did not leave behind any written records?
That's a fantastic question, right? And in many ways, a fundamental question for African American history, for historians of new social historical topics, and more broadly. There are certain records that were out of reach for a long time. Again, I knew that there were documents in the collector of customs records in archives too, and I couldn't find them. Right? And kind of, I was worried that I might have to write the book without that source. Robert Smalls doesn't leave papers, and so he appears in various files written about. Occasionally, you find something in his voice. There's a really interesting North American Review article that Robert Smalls pins. But again, this is where you learn to read against her. And this is where the Black press became really important. So some of this is finding a source base that, again, has been digitized for a long time. But I think as scholars, those digital newspapers have been read front and back maybe once or twice, right? People have written these big histories of specific papers. They've thought about the papers as occupying nodes of the Black public sphere, but the deeper work of really grounding and sitting in that, right? That's what the lack of sources required me to do, right? So there was a project that could have been a repeat or reiteration of a narrow story that Stephen Hans tells in 10 pages, right? That's figuring out how to make that into a 250, 100-page book. That could have been the project. The wrestling with the sources, thinking about the interventions made by people like Gabrielle Foreman, Delani Davis, and others, that there's something broader and bigger here, that there are people moving back and forth across national, and increasingly scholars saying international lines, that there is a conversation happening, right? And this is, again, an intervention that I kind of think of through Julia Scott, the Common Man, right? This ability to capture cultural currents, capture these kind of broader political currents. Again, there's a Whiggishness to the project. There's a way that if you follow Black newspaper sources, you're going to overrepresent the talented 10th. I recognize and see that critique of the book, but I'm also aware that we need to think about cultural power and cultural capital, the way that we don't really have a class formation history of those people Du Bois calls the talented 10th, right? We understand politics, respectability, and racial destiny as something that's elite driven, and we can kind of freeze that conversation just in the kind of politics, respectability discourse. But I think if we push a little bit further, right, bring in class analysis, think about Femi Taiwo's elite capture kind of examination, right? They're different ways to tackle the book questions through a responsible lens.
All right, I'll jump in then with what could be our last question here. I'm wondering about audience. As you were writing the book, what sort of audience did you imagine? How has that changed maybe now that the book is in the world? And just sort of main takeaway, what do you want people to take away after reading this book itself?
That's a great question. I mean, I guess first and foremost, right, I understand myself as writing to a tradition of African American history. Um, that work that I was kind of got from people like Elsa Barkley Brown, obviously Robin D.G. Kelly is someone whose work shines a big light in this canon, this tradition, this trajectory. I'm also interested in speaking to scholars of Civil War era memory, right? The shadow of David Blight looms large in this book. And so I think the broadest audience of this book, maybe not the broadest, but the academic audience, the core audience of this book are people who enjoyed race and reunion, right? If you like race and reunion, this book is for you. Um, I can imagine and think about publics and kind of non-academic publics, right? I was in the Low Country speaking about this book, and those who are in that place, which is a very important place. So if you were to kind of get a little saccharine, you might say it's a little bit of a magical place, right? There's a different energy signature of the Low Country than other places. You can. I'm writing to people who are concerned about that history or thinking about the history of that place, but also the broad kind of public that is thinking about Reconstruction, right? Those who are wrestling with what does Reconstruction mean? How are we living with the afterlife of Reconstruction? In what ways are we not or living through a third Reconstruction, thinking about the legacy of the second Reconstruction, concerned about questions of voter rights and the reversal of the Voting Rights Act, interested in the questions of Black cultural life, right? The questions that Amani Perry raises in her work, the right questions that we can see in a scholar like Jarvis Givens or Jarvis McGinnis. Those broad questions about the Black South, those broad questions about Black intellectual practices, right? That kind of cultural moment of discussion debate that kind of circulated around Ta-Nehisi Coates' blog in 2015, right? I'm thinking about that as maybe a broadest public.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Bland, thank you so much for the time and for the talk as well. We absolutely enjoyed it. I wish you the best of success with this book. I've read it cover to cover a couple times now, and it is absolutely phenomenal. So thank you so much.
Mari, I really appreciate the kind words. I appreciate you organizing it. For all those who came out, all those who asked questions, I appreciate that. I hope to see some of you at the Society of Civil War Historians Conference in Richmond. If there's any way I can help you in your journey moving forward, let me know. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much and take care.